Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Virtual Views, and most importantly, welcome to Film Vault Summer Camp. I'm Rajendra Roy. I'm the Celeste Bartos Chief Curator of Film here at the Museum of Modern Art, and it's my great pleasure to be joined this evening by the incredible filmmaker, someone that I am always inspired by, Todd Haynes. Welcome, Todd.
Hey, Raj. How are you? Great to be here.
It's great to see you. Thank you for sharing this August evening with us. We'll hope to make it a sultry evening of fun conversation. Before we dive in, I want to give a big shout out and thank you to all the MoMA members and donors who are joining us this evening. If you're not already a member, please do consider joining moma.org/join. We will be coming to you all for the rest of August with more Film Vault Summer Camp, as well as a robust lineup of digital offerings throughout the fall season. I also want to give a special thanks to Chanel, who sponsor all of the film events at MoMA. And they kind of came to us first with our film benefit, which is a way that Todd and I have worked together most recently. In fact, right behind me, you're actually in the Film Study Center in my office. And right behind me, there's a picture of Todd and I, actually with Kate and Marty. I'm going to pull this up. And Kate's wearing Chanel. Oh, you can't see it there. Kate's wearing Chanel because it was her benefit evening. There's a photo of Julianne Moore, and I at a film benefit. We're also wearing Chanel. So thank you, Chanel. But most of all, because both of those evenings brought Todd to MoMA, we wish that we could have you with us tonight. We wish we could have everyone with us here on site at MoMA tonight, but not quite yet. I also want to thank, of course, our annual Film Fund donors for making all this possible. So Todd and I are going to chat for a bit, and then we definitely want to hear from you all. So if you have questions, please leave them in the YouTube live chat section, and our producer, Sean, will forward me those questions as we get further along in the conversation. But first off, Todd, great to see you. Last time we saw each other in real life was actually in Portland. Literally, it feels like nanoseconds before the whole world changed. It was in the process of changing. We just hadn't really caught up to the reality of it quite yet. And we were both there to get these amazing glowy things from Amy and the really cool crew at the Northwest Film Center, the Cinema Unbound Awards. And it was the thrill of a lifetime to be honored at the same time as you. So, and that was my first time to Portland, but you are back in Portland now. Is that true?
I am here. I've been away for almost 2 years of extended work elsewhere, mostly New York, some shooting in Ohio, and a lot of LA, where we cut the last film that I did. But I'm back. I'm renting this house. My house is being worked on, and it's dragging on, and it's COVID era, and that's contributing to the delays. But yeah, Portland, Portland. Oh my God, Portland has so been in the crosshairs.
Well, it's certainly been in our thoughts, and sending a lot of good energy. Obviously, New York has gone through it as well. But I think, if nothing else, you've dispelled the notion that you're an IKEA and a minimalist, which some people might have read into your backdrop. So thank you for that. But in all seriousness, we're glad you're safe.
Thank you.
We're glad you're safe, and we're going to be talking a little bit about what you've been up to. But first, this is a conversation about, in the context of summer camp, Film Vault Summer Camp, where we're showing treasures and obscurities from the film archive here at MoMA. And I was wondering, what is the first non-first run movie that you can remember seeing? So what's the first old movie you remember seeing, if you can think back?
Oh man, old movie. Well, look, I grew up in Los Angeles, and I came of age in the 70s, and this was an era when repertory programming in cinemas were at an apex, and that's certainly true for Los Angeles. Was true for most big cities around the country and the world, and LA had a really remarkable repertory culture. So, I would watch movies on TV as a kid, and there were some that were incredibly memorable to me that were still not new releases. And I mean, obviously they were on TV. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf was became an obsession of mine when I was about 12. Edward Albee came to Los Angeles when his play Seascape opened in LA, starring Deborah Carr, and I went there dutifully with a friend and waited backstage to meet Edward Albee and hand him drawings I'd done from Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. Which was very, very sweet and graciously accepted.
Yeah. Well, I'm smiling hugely, and I would turn my camera around, but I'd screw up our whole Zoom. But there's literally a poster of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf on the wall in my office right there.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
And there's a picture of me and Mike right there because, that was his was the first retro I ever did at MoMA. So. Oh
wow! Amazing. That's incredible.
See, so, yeah, it was meant to be. But so yeah, that is amazing. Do you remember if you saw that on TV? That
I saw on television. That was a big, serious TV viewing experience, and then it turned into, it was weird. I met Jack Albee, who was Edward Albee's cousin, who was a mime, backstage at that same event. And
sorry, I just heard what you said.
Right? This was 1970, two. I was very into mime as well. And I remembered Jack Albee from performing at the LA County Museum.
Wow.
And I totally remembered it, but he had this mime theater, he said. And I was there with my friend, Matt Rosen, who was also, we were both into painting and art, and we would both become gay.
Yeah.
And
really?
Really? And we, I don't know where the idea was hatched, but we said, it'd be so cool if we could do a performance of Zoo Story at your theater. And this actually came to pass. And so when I was 12 and Matt was 9, we performed Zoo Story for a series of selected nights on Fountain Avenue in Hollywood at the Jack Albee Mime Theater. And I just prayed that Edward Albee would show up. He did not.
I think we can just end there because it's literally not going to get better than
that. I mean, I didn't want friends my age to go. I only wanted their parents to come. This was too serious.
I mean, it's all so clear now. It's just like done. I get it.
Right? You know this.
So let's stay in that era actually, because my follow-up was about a different kind of archive, one that we've been really digging into here, and that's amateur filmmaking and specifically home movie making. We actually have an exhibition. It's both a virtual view and in real life when we reopen, celebrating the home movie. And I'm wondering, did your family make home movies? Do you have an archive of family movies? Because I know that small gauge film is something that in your professional career you've really embraced as well. But I was just wondering about that.
No, we did. And my grandfather, who actually worked at Warner Brothers in the late 30s and early 40s as head of set construction, and left around the Blacklist time and started a company, went to a different field. He had a 60 millimeter camera, and in the 40s and 50s, people often had 16 millimeter home movie cameras.
Yeah.
And he'd do these little cute films of my mom running around and superimpose little titles, "The End," on her butt, but I definitely inherited that from my grandparents, who were a big part of my life, and made my first movies on Super 8 that came out of the home movie tradition of shooting on Super 8 that my parents had, my parents were a part of. We had a little projector, we had an editor, so all my first productions were on Super 8.
Yeah, I had a sneaking suspicion, but you never really know. But that intimacy and also that familiarity, I think that those of us who grew up in home movie households, it just was that natural thing. I mean, for me, the oldest movie, just to, since I asked you all share mine, was my dad was a Marx Brothers fanatic, and he would tape old Marx Brothers movies off MGM Classics on TV to like skip through the commercials or whatever. And then we had one of those old, the early VHS machines, the big clunkers, the tanks.
Yeah.
And we would schlep it to dinner parties at, like at that point in the late 70s, early 80s, nobody had, VCRs. and we would watch old Marx Brothers movies on repeat. So some of my staff are convinced that I actually am Groucho Marx some days, but anyway.
Did you also have Super 8?
Yeah, he shot all of his home movies on, first it was regular 8 and then Super 8, and he even got sound Super 8, you know, so we have mag strip Super
exactly. 8. Yeah, with the mag attached.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so yeah, if you were able to come to MoMA right now and you looked really hard in the gallery of hundreds of images of family movies, you could actually see Baby Raj running around in there, because I did donate them to MoMA. But anyway, my crazy colleagues picked them. But anyway, moving on and away from me, as you were studying at Brown, where you famously met your producing partner, Christine Vachon, and there's like this incredible history there. Did you make use of archives when you were kind of getting, you know, forming yourself as a filmmaker, as an artist, and then as a filmmaker? Do you recall having access to film archives specifically, or archives generally?
It's a good question. I feel like I'm forgetting examples of having access to archives while making films, but they really didn't play a part in the films that I was making at that time.
Yeah.
We shot everything ourselves. And I mean, I shot when I was finally doing Superstar after having left Providence and moving to New York, my Karen Carpenter movie. That was full of all kinds of stolen material of all kinds, of course, famously. So, but a lot of it was archival stuff just shot off the television with a Super 8 camera.
I see. Yeah. Because clearly you've been a voracious consumer of cinema history, and I think that's why so many of us have gravitated earlier, you know, in your career to your work, and have seen that flourish. And I want to talk about your now emergence in the period where, as Mike, actually he coined this, he's like, you can look at your own old movies now. And that's not a comment on your age, just on your prolific greatness. But I thought if you wouldn't mind, we could kind of like talk in three strands that kind of relate to the three films that we're screening this week as part of summer camp. So again, this whole month of August, our collection specialist, Ashley Swinnerton, selected, or films that actually people like you, filmmakers, artists, scholars, have requested over and over from our Film Study Center. And I asked about you as a student because I want people to be aware that as artists and scholars, researchers, you can come to MoMA when you're able to come to MoMA and ask for anything from the film collection. So prints, documents, scripts, all of that. And if you're researching a new project or a book or whatever, we'll provide that to you at no cost. And so, I mean, I think that's an important message for this whole month. But the three films we're showing this week, an excerpt from a 1914 unfinished work, which would have been the first feature film with an all African-American cast, starring Burt Williams. And so that was one, that is one. You can see that now online at MoMA.org. A Technicolor screen test, Katharine Hepburn auditioning for screen testing for Joan of Arc, a project that was never realized. And then finally, Andy Warhol's Kiss. So in the context of the first piece of the Burt Williams piece, I mean, you have been such a champion of unearthing stories that have been hidden or buried or kind of manipulated in really insidious ways throughout cinema history. And that film is an example, right? Amongst many other things, it is also an incredible portrait of a Black middle class that existed over 100 years ago, that because this film was never completed and released, was essentially buried from cinema history. It was erased by its absence from a public viewing for so long. But I was thinking specifically around queer lives on screen. You have been such an incredible champion of unearthing them through your work. We actually had a question from Susan Jonas, who's been a MoMA member for 4 years. And she asked, you humanize so people who are usually demonized. And I think, in many cases, those are queer lives. What was it, an impulse that was influenced by other filmmakers that you admired that kind of led you to do that? Or can you maybe just talk a little bit about your amazing compulsion to help unearth these stories.
Well, yeah, thank you for the question. I think, you know, it comes out of different motivations at different times. I don't know that I would say about myself that there's a humanist drive to sort of redeem minority or oppressed narratives necessarily. I feel like something about the otherness that has been part of the history of representing marginal stories and characters and narratives is something that I'm not necessarily interested in correcting. That in a way, the framing that a culture puts around depictions of otherness, and that in my films has, I think, been reflected in sexual orientation, in stories about women, and in racial themes as well. And also in the sort of common despair of a lot of people living in heteronormative lives as well.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are women. I mean, I guess that would be an operative through line in a lot of my films, you know, and the interest in melodrama. But I think today in particular, we're in this sort of era of a kind of intense desire to correct historical language from the past and kind of recuperate errors and missteps along the way. And I guess I feel like I'm always a little ambivalent about that corrective gesture, that kind of intense identity politic way of wanting to affirm identity as something organic and sort of redeem it. In a way, I think we have more critical facility and more radical facility by thinking of identity as something constructed.
Yeah.
And when you're writing alternative narratives, that you have a chance to enter into a fictional process that's really, really important to feel the freedom of, so that we can depict things without, you know, that kind of batting down, I guess, to notions of absolute truth, or even my truth versus your truth, that kind of competition of subjectivity and marginality. And so a lot of my characters who are gay in my films are difficult subjects.
Yeah.
And they make you think about the way the history of representing gay people is always corroded by, or, you know, infected by the social languages that we all inherit, we all live in. And so you have to think, I like, at least, or I'm drawn to filmmakers who make you think about the language and not just the subject or the object.
Yeah. Apologize to everybody. There's a little New York going on in the background, but we're in Midtown, so
good thing.
Nice. No, I mean, I'm glad you brought up that fluidity. I mean, the fluidity of and the creation of identity, because I think that is also something central to what many of us have embraced about your work. And it's interesting with the next project with the Katharine Hepburn screen test. I mean, here's the potential construction of a queer icon, right? Joan of Arc has been embraced as this tragic, you know, perpetually tragic queer icon. But, you know, Hepburn didn't actually get to portray her. And in the end, that snippet is actually more interesting as a documentation of a Technicolor process. And the kind of mythology around Technicolor and that technology that has existed. That's actually, I think, Ashley has pointed out, and Katie Traynor, our collections manager, it gets requested very often because it's like, people are like, that's Technicolor. I mean, it's kind of muted tones and all of that. We've had a lot of questions about your work because you, I mean, to put it in rather crass terms, have embraced vintage technology, let's say, as a strategy. But, you know, more so, I see it as kind of an embrace of authenticity. And in a way, that clip, we've gotten a lot of pushback at MoMA, because when we do Technicolor restorations, we try and go back to what we feel would have been the authentic look of when that version of Technicolor was released. And it's usually not the version of Technicolor people think of, right? They think there was one version, and it's this, I can't even say it without saying Technicolor, but these cherry pop kind of reds and all of that. So we got a couple of questions. One from Robert Brush, MoMA member for 7 years, and Joshua Freed, both kind of relating to your use of technology, and specifically, maybe you could talk about film stock and your. I mean, obviously we'll have to talk about Ed Lachman as well, but just using technology of a certain period to kind of augment your storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And these days in particular, in the digital takeover, basically, of our industry and of filmmaking, these resistances to the sort of technology trends and efficiency and ease. And look, I shot my last feature, Ed and I shot my last feature, Dark Waters, on digital. It was the first film I've ever shot on digital. And we'd done little bits of digital stuff when we had to on other films, but mostly they're all shot on film. And we thought we wanted to shoot on film, but we couldn't make the argument in the budget. And look, it's a tool. It's another tool like other mediums or whatever. It's a non-linear editing, which is a remarkable thing. I think my appreciation of the ways that we can edit today are only deepened by the fact that I used to cut linearly on film, and that I understand what a leap that is. That said, yes, there's been a continued interest of mine, and it's reflected in specific works and when they're set, and the kinds of films I'm looking at in relation to those works, like Far From Heaven, which is so indebted to the work of Cirque and Max O'Fools, and we really were embracing a kind of Technicolor language in that movie. But that's also combined with all kinds of other elements of color that exist in the design, in the lighting, and in all of the things that are happening on set. But that kind of, for me, I've always said that every film I do is sort of like a learning process that I'm giving myself, an assignment, that I'm trying to study something. And so I commit myself to whatever it is. In Wonderstruck, we were looking a great deal at silent cinema for half of that film. But each film sort of brings up its own historical sort of framework and references that I end up, diving into very deeply and learning so much from.
Can you recall for us on Wonderstruck specifically, when you were doing those silent segments, how you shot those? I mean, I've heard some stories, but I'm never quite sure. Like, did you actually go back and use old lenses, that kind of stuff?
We were using old lenses. We weren't using lenses from the teens, or we weren't being that academic or rigorous. Ed definitely loves Cook lenses from the 60s and 70s, and the sort of imperfections inherent in lenses from that period. And I'm pretty sure that's what we used in Wonderstruck. What was so, I was working with a deaf actor, so the whole limited, and there was no spoken dialogue in the movie, in the black and white part of the film. And so everything about how I directed actors and how we used the sort of visual iconography of the silent era as inspiration for how not that it is anything but the most vast and sophisticated language by the time sound came in. Already every kind of genre, every conceivable sort of stylistic tradition in cinema had been explored in silent film. And it reflected globally cultures and characteristics of cultural influences that were so deeply ingrained, in the work of German expressionism and Soviet cinema, of course, and amazing work in America. But editing that film was so interesting. That part of the film was so interesting because we needed to find music,
Yeah.
cut the film to before you could even put two images together. So you actually had to score the film in advance of how the images would start to work together. So we found that there was all kinds of reversals in the process of putting that film together that just sort of made you think completely differently, like coming around through the back side of the mirror in the process.
Yeah. No, we last week, as part of this series, we launched a film called The Flying Train. It's from 1902, and it literally is a camera mounted on the suspended train in Wuppertal, Germany, that still exists. And Wim Wenders actually used it in his Pina Bausch documentary of a few years back. But it's a black and white, it's just black and white footage. And it has like 250,000 views, you know, in a week. And it's already been redigitized, remixed, slowed down, colorized, like all this, like people are obviously fascinated with the period, with older work, but also in bringing it into like their realm. I mean, it's gotten so current that literally yesterday we got a question if Kamala Harris had an opinion about the flying train. Well, I'm sure she has nothing else to think about, but anyway, we got a quick live question from Penny Feiner. So in the end, do you have a preference, film or digital?
Oh, film. There's no question.
Yeah.
There's no question.
Kind of thought I might know the answer to the question, but just to establish it. So then moving on to this week's final addition to the lineup, Kiss by Andy Warhol. And I just want to thank our friends at the Warhol Museum, especially Patrick Moore, the director there, and Greg Pierce, curator of film, for allowing us to screen this, because as far as we know, and they're concerned, this is the first time a Warhol film has legally screened online. There are tons of pirated versions out there, but this is, I mean, before that, you know, MoMA is the distributor of all of Andy's films. The Warhol Museum is the rights holder. And through the film circulating library, you could request any, you know, if you've seen a Warhol film, it's usually been through the film circulating library.
Yeah.
You probably sent to your university and it was projected on 16 millimeter. This is the first time ever folks are able to see an authorized version legally screened online. So thank you, friends at the Warhol. But also it brings us to the current moment. And I'll just lead off with a question that I already know the answer to, but I'll let you answer. It's a question from Karen Horowitz. Have you been working on any new projects during COVID?
Is that Karen, did you say?
Yes.
Yes, Karen, I have been. Thank you for the question. Yeah, and Raj got to even see a little sneak peek at what we've been up to. I've just been so, God, this has just been such an amazingly nourishing project creatively for me. This is my first documentary, and it's a documentary about the Velvet Underground. And the timing was so fortuitous because I was able to shoot and basically, you know, conduct almost all of the interviews in 2018 before, with Ed shooting them, Ed Lockman.
Yeah.
Before I had to go off and do Dark Waters.
Oh, wow.
And so we had them in the bag, right? And we had the majority of our voices. And so Afonso Gonçalves, my editor, I've been working with since Mildred Pierce. Fonzie, who he is allowed to be called, and
forever.
He cut with an editing partner, Adam Kernitz, the Stooges doc by Jim Jarmusch, right?
Yeah.
And they were doing it concurrently with Pete Patterson.
Yeah.
And so it was a similar situation where there was a feature Fonzie was working on with Jim alongside a documentary project. And he brought Adam, this remarkable artist and partner, into the process of working on Jim's film. And Adam sort of began work on that while Fonzie's attentions were still on Patterson. And that's exactly what we did during Dark Water. So Adam began to build the house that the film became editorially. And that's so much what documentary filmmaking is really about, is how much you're writing it in the editing process. But when finally Dark Waters was done, and I got to turn my attention to something so utterly different in temperament, in texture, in history, in language. And we were trying to do some very different things using archives and really delving into the language and the sinew and the texture and the unbelievable exuberance of 60s avant-garde cinema that surrounded this culture and permeated the experiences of all of these artists working in different mediums. Yeah. And that gave birth to and really defines in so many ways what the Velvet Underground were and how their music came into being. And but it's such an archive-based film that when I finally got to turn my attentions to it fully, it was right at the very end of last year and the very end to the beginning of this year. And I was in LA when Fonzie and I were there together, and then COVID hit. And I was staying at a place in Venice, and we were editing at an editing room in Venice that I could walk to from my apartment in Venice. And Fonzie and I were like, well, we've been in it together this long. We're probably gonna be okay with each other. Everybody else cleared out of this facility. And it was just Fonzie and I. And Adam was in New York, and the three of us just maintained this sort of closeness in the process. And the two of them also were generous and kind enough and patient enough to let me get my hands on it and do some editing myself on the movie. And I haven't really had my hands on a film to this degree, probably since my Dylan movie, I'm Not There. These are just films that, needed everyone's hands on deck, and even mine. But it's just been a fantastic creative process working with Fonz and Adam on the film, and Motto Pictures are the producers, amazing people who are doing this incredible job. The amount of archives that we've collected for the film are remarkable. I mean, the closing credit sequence alone is about 9 minutes long, just to name all of the sources.
Thank God there's really cool end roll music to
right. Where did we find that music? It's great.
So having had the extreme privilege of having a look at a cut of this documentary, I know that Warhol's own film production was critical to your film. And again, it kind of inspired me when I thought of who could talk about accessing archives and leveraging it to create new work. I thought immediately of you because of this project. And without giving too much away, I'm wondering if you can talk to how his films may have informed decisions that you made. And I'm thinking, there are Warhol, those of us who have studied Warhol's film production, and it's such an amazing thing to immerse yourself in. But there are things like duration and intimacy and immediacy, all these like strategies that he would use to create a cinema that it really didn't exist to the same extent. I mean, there were other people working. There was Jack Smith. There were people that influenced him, but he did come out of it with this whole vocabulary of cinema that was in a way brand new. Obviously, Jonas was a huge influence. Which, well, anyway, talk a little bit about what. I don't want to say anything because I don't want to mess anything up because it's your movie. But
well, look, Warhol, in every conceivable way, as a film artist, as a visual artist, and as a central figure who was a magnet for a kind of artistic culture. And what it can't be overstated, I guess, is the end of that first sentence. But and because of that, I mean, there's so many ways, I guess it's almost hard to start to pull them all out. But I really felt that an important component to remind us all about the Velvet Underground, who have been so canonized after so many years of inspiring and sort of being ahead of musical genres in rock that have followed their, unsuccessful attempt at reaching a large audience in the 60s.
Yeah.
But how influential that band has become, and this always happens, and this was a part of the ambition behind making another film with the word velvet in it, the Velvet Goldmine, about the glam era, was that the gayness, the queerness, the the sense of camp and what that sort of raises in terms of the way artists, particularly Warhol, were calling into question all kinds of attitudes and assumptions and ways of reading dominant culture that had preceded him in his work, in his films, in his art, but also in the way he lived and the way he drew people around him in the factory. And I insist that there's something essential about that queerness too, or gayness, because gayness is really a more appropriate word, or faggotiness.
Let's get to the marrow here. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Swishiness. Our production company is called Swish Productions.
Well, there you go.
Motherwell and Jasper Johns didn't want to hang out with Andy Warhol too much.
The Swish would rub off.
Yeah. But that, I think, is an essential aspect of this music.
Yeah.
And it's not just Lou Reed, but it's a way of reading culture. It's a way of seeing, and Warhol might call that popism, and Susan Sontag might call that camp. Yeah. But it was a way of framing the way you looked at mass American culture. Yeah. and the desire that we all have to read it and watch it and see it, and consume it. And but it really was so much about, again, the language more than it was about the content. And so that part of his preoccupation in his films expose what the language of cinema is and the traditions that he was defying. Yeah. And make you wonder what makes a movie? Why do we put this on the screen and not that? How long is a movie allowed to be? How absent is its subjects? All of these questions. And what's so remarkable about Warhol is he was the most profoundly philosophical artist, but he made the questions that he raised so easy for anybody to. There's a really beautiful story of Jonathan Richman, who's in our movie, who is the musician behind Modern Lovers, and was a real influence by, he loved the Velvet Underground when he was a teenager, hung out with them and saw 85 shows in Boston and was their mascot, basically. And the first night he heard them play in Cambridge, they were just about to break with Warhol, but Warhol was there at the show, and so was Nico. She wasn't even allowed on stage at this point. So little Jonathan Richman, awkward teenager, met Warhol and heard the Velvet Underground, and he loved that music already. He had the album, and met Nico, and he went up to Warhol and he said, "Mr. Warhol, I don't really think I understand your art." And Andy said, "Yes, you do."
Which is like the most profoundly generous thing,
right?
Any artist could say.
Exactly. And it's so true. We all understand his art.
Yeah.
And you understand it in those elemental ways.
Yeah. Before we move to the open questions, I could go on and on about Warhol, and someday I will. I mean, if you just want to tell folks, it's going to be a little while probably before people get to see it.
Yeah, we don't know. Our release plans are tied to a theatrical release of the film, which I'm still maybe, stubbornly clinging to. We all want it to be seen on the big screen and heard in a room, but we don't know yet. So we're kind of watching how that plays out.
Yeah. Well, if I have anything to say about it, it will play at our theater at some point in its lifespan, hopefully early on, because what better place? So again, before we move to the open session, and do drop your questions in the YouTube chat if you have live questions for Todd. I do want to bring Ed into this, and you did mention that he was able to work on Velvet Underground, but I just, what I noticed with Dark Waters, which is a film that I love, by the way, was that for me, it really shifted away from talking about your work in relationship to other filmmakers, and it really established this Haynesian aesthetic, which has existed for a while now. but I don't think I even allowed myself to feel at liberty to describe it in those terms. And I think what the shift was taking on a subject matter or a type of narrative that I was unexpected for me, at least. It was probably naive of me not to expect this from you, but and the way that you and working with your collaborators and certainly Ed Lockman as an essential collaborator on this really turned it into something that I was like, my God, he can turn that magic on to any type of film. And just wondering if you wanted, I mean, I'm talking it up because I feel like not enough people saw it. It came out at a weird time, you know, all this stuff, but yeah, just a little bit about working on that project, if you, and with Ed specifically, if you want. I'm actually shocked to learn it was digital. I probably should have known that, but.
It's funny, we tricked other journalists. I was very proud. In France, people were like, no, it could not be digital. It was digital. Well, look, I mean, that's so nice the way you set up that question. You know, to me, I feel like, and this goes back to questions about archives and film history and the kind of scholarly interests and just the love of movies that has always defined and motivated me as a filmmaker, that in so many ways I feel like whether or not I'm using appropriated images or archival images in my films, I always feel, and even whether or not they're films I've written or developed myself on the page, I feel like they are always so indebted to the work that I'm examining at the time. And that in a way, I almost feel like I'm always an archivist in my filmmaking. Maybe that's understating or not, you know, acknowledging the thing people have said, the thing that makes certain creators who they are is the thing they least see themselves, you know, yeah. And maybe that's true in some ways about me. But for Dark Waters, it was such a, it was such a tremendous opportunity to look at a genre of films that I've always loved, and that this script and this story so remarkably called upon us to apply to more contemporary setting. And it's the sort of paranoia films of the 70s and the amazing Pakula films, but it cast as sort of visual iconography and language across so much of American filmmaking during that decade. And so many of them were shot by Gordon Willis. And so we were really, really watching, and I was paying such acute attention. It's such an education for any filmmaker to watch his cinematography. And I know Ed feels the same way, and his lighting, of course. But there's things that go beyond just the way he shoots a shot or, you know, lights a shot, that you see almost more dramatically when you see how the films he shot cross through very different directors' work, from Woody Allen's films to Coppola's films to Pakula's films, right? Yeah. The films that he made, and the way the frame sort of calls for a kind of choreography of bodies, because the frame is not going to tell you where to look. It's going to hold back, you know, and there's going to be a coolness about it, and a real keenness about the way we should look at this scene and this place. And it was just such a, you know, there were other, Michael Mann's The Insider is a fantastic film that I looked at a lot for this film for the generic reasons. But it's such a different kind of language in terms of the camera and in terms of editing and music and everything Michael Mann does so great, so well. But with Willis, it's just this coolness and this objectivity I can't even say objectivity, because it's so, you know, defined. It's so insistent. It's so, you know, it's motivated or something, you know.
But that insistence upon the fluidity or liberty of view, I mean, it's both exhilarating and terrifying to think that you would frame something where you're not instructing us how to look necessarily, and that it's up to us to explore that. And I'm thinking about parallels in the way that you also then construct or allow the construction of identity through your characters, and it's all coming together. And maybe that's the Haynesian aesthetic that I'm talking about. And thank you for thank you for making that really clear. And I encourage folks that haven't seen it to explore it, because it really is remarkable. It does bring us to probably the most urgent question for many viewers, and Kayla sent a question just in, and that has a little bit to do with paranoia and of course Safe, which has become this almost go-to film in the COVID era. So many people have gravitated towards its, the perceived messages within the film and applying them to our current times. And I have to say, going back and looking at it, I was like, oh my God, it is about COVID, but it's not. So her question is, do you see it bound to a certain time, or is it more universal human experience, the narrative of Safe?
Well, yeah, it's funny. I haven't gone back and watched it during this time, but there's been a lot of the super interesting things that have cropped up by journalists about it, and people revisiting the film, and which I've seen most of, I think. And it's a film that it's a film that really was a film I really wanted to make at that time. But it was a very hard film for us to get financed. And even when we were just looking for $1 million after my first feature, Poison, which had won the prize at Sundance, and we thought, oh, this shouldn't be so hard. It's just this seemed like nothing like a new queer cinema film, following the expectations that Poison had sort of stirred up. But both Poison and Safe were films about the AIDS era, and they were inspired by that time and place. And that was a time and a place that that deeply influenced my life and so many of our lives who lived through it. There's so much loss embedded in that time. And I feel like at that first rudimentary level, that's an obvious parallel to what we're going through now. That, there was a Douglas Crimp article that he wrote during the AIDS era that was really about remembering how much we're deferring mourning just because of survival needs, and how much that penetrated the moment we were in, to remember that we are holding off on feeling the loss that is almost insurmountable. You can't possibly digest the magnitude of it. And I think there's something very similar to that. And Safe, because Safe shifts the discussion more into how disease is interpreted and to ways that we try to comprehend illness, and very much this thing that I was seeing happen around HIV that was this sort of recovery industry language, and the readiness of people to accept culpability for things that are beyond their control or understanding, and how much when we are sick, we blame ourselves for our conditions of being sick. And that becomes a very convenient kind of tendency in humans or Americans or Californians or however you're sourcing it, for a free market sensibility that basically keeps blaming people for their own conditions and not accepting the role the government can play in helping people out who are in states of vulnerability or pain or suffering. And so that is an impossible thing to not compare as well to what's happening today, and the way that a complete hands-off policy from the government, which distinguishes our government's response to COVID from every other industrialized country in the world, even those with very hard right leadership and governments, this complete negation of responsibility and handing it off to the states and to governors and in a way, even now, people have to make decisions about whether to send their kids to school or not. And, you know, everything is our own decision to make. We're on our own. And that compounds the situation to such a degree that it is such an incredible, you know, it's such a horror. It makes this incredibly challenging time so much harder on people. The abdication of responsibility and compassion, and let alone compassion, or things we would never expect from this president. So the isolation that we leave Carol White with in Safe, you know, is something that I also think we all are struggling with and trying to figure out how to survive right now, as the answer, the only solution to weathering this storm, you know, is the way we have to pull away from each other. And if anything, the unbelievable turning out for people on the street after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and to me was, of course, as much was about racial injustice and about police brutality and systemic racism, but it was also an urgent, you know, antidote to what was happening with COVID, and a rejection of a government and a system that's making us reject each other,
right,
and apart from each other.
It was the antithesis of "you're alone," right? It's like,
yeah,
we're here too.
Exactly.
Speaking of "we're here too," you have a bunch of friends who are watching, and Marcus, who has been jumping up and down and I think he might actually be with John Waters right now. So.
Oh my God.
Hi, Marcus. Hi, John. We've already answered your question, so we're not going to get to that. But there's a couple of questions that it speaks directly to archives, and specifically yours. It's from Maxwell, and let's see, from Paulina. It's about assassins, and how can folks see assassins? Because it's one of your early shorts. It's hard to see. I asked ourselves the question of whether we secretly have it, and if we do, it is a very big secret because we haven't found it. But do you know if there's a way for people to see assassins?
You know, what's so funny is assassins that never got transferred adequately from. I think there's 2 prints of assassins that exist, and one, I believe, is at Bard College still. Okay. Adolphus Mikas never gave it back, and then I was sort of like, that's okay. They hang on to, that's cool. And then I think the other one is, I think, in the Killer vaults. But it's something I should really get a decent transfer. One very bad kinescope was made from the print once, but it was not a very good copy, and today we could do much better. So it's something I should look into.
Well, maybe thanks to our brilliant audience suggestions, it's something that would kick me in the ass to actually get on that and help you get that done, because that would be amazing. So one last question from the audience, and it has to do, it's again from Kayla. I'm not sure if it's the same Kayla as before, but whether Arthur Stewart in Velvet Goldmine, there've been a bunch of questions about Velvet Goldmine, was your stand-in, and in the way that he was searching and researching and investigating, and since we've been on the topic of investigating archives and history, and is he you? Are you him? Like, are you?
I mean, I wish I was that.
And would you cast Christian Bale as yourself? I guess it's like.
Right, exactly. Pretty narcissistic move there. Well, I think he was our way in, as viewers, and into a sort of, in a way, he was sort of the anonymous journalist in Citizen Kane, who becomes a subject, who finds himself in his own almost recovered memory of the story to be actually a part of the story, and somebody who actually had intimacy with some of these people, but he had to repress it because it was too unbearable, a memory of pleasure and desire fulfilled, to take with him into this sort of, again, fictional description of the 1980s that was as much indebted to David Bowie's creation of 1984 dystopia as the real 80s, although interestingly how similar they were. But no, that's a really, it's a cool question. I mean, I also felt such affection for that character, and Christian maintained a Mancunian accent from Manchester through the entirety of the film shooting, you know, without being silly about it or pompous about it or anything like that. He just did his work and his research. And and the making of Velvet Goldmine, which was actually very hard on me and Christine, it was a very ambitious film to make for the budget. We did succeed in allowing the constant movable feast of that film to spill into the experiences of the actors and the makers of the film. So there was a kind of constant party going on while making Velvet Goldmine in London. And I remember when Christian folded, when we had wrapped, and it was the wrap party, and he said he had folded up his clothes and his Mancunian accent was gone. And I can't remember if he said he cried a little or if I cried a little, but there were some tears about saying goodbye to Arthur Stewart.
Oh. Well, this is my last question. It's on the extremely silly side, but you know, what the hell? And it actually relates to Velvet Goldmine. So this now Velvet Underground will be your second film with Velvet in the title. So I'm wondering, can we propose that you do that with some of your other titles? So, for example, Poison, but make it about the 80s band Poison.
Right.
Carol, but make it the Carol Channing story.
The new era of Karens. No,
that's
too new.
Yeah, God. Oh, thank God it wasn't you didn't call it Carol. But no, maybe it's the Carol Channing story. Or maybe you just swap the titles of Safe and Carol because they're both about Carol.
Well, I was thinking earlier, funny somebody brought up Assassins, because I was thinking some Assassins came to mind. The full title of Assassins is Assassins, a film concerning Rimbaud.
Right.
And, you know, who knows, it may very well have concerned Rimbaud, that movie. But then I thought Velvet Goldmine should have been subtitled A Film Very Much Concerning David Bowie, because he never wanted it to exist. And as opposed to I'm Not There, which was a film that didn't really concern Bob Dylan at all. And in fact,
what does?
And that's why he gave us all his rights. So
the last suggestion, and it's Far From Heaven, but make it about an Icelandic twink named Fa. And on that note, folks, I want to thank our distinguished guest, ending on a corny joke. Todd, you've been amazing. Just so everybody knows, this is the only Zoom talk you've done through this whole period. Obviously, you've been working and in some sort of editorial paradise in Venice with Fonzie, and you know, but we're so grateful, and I've learned a ton, and it's been a joy to spend the time with you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you everybody for joining us online. It's been a great opportunity to share some time with a great filmmaker, but also with all of you. If you didn't catch this live, or you only caught part of it, and you know only the stale jokes at the end, it will be live recorded on MoMA.org in the virtual views on the magazine section shortly, so you can watch the whole thing or enjoy it again. We've had people tune in from all over the world, obviously wherever Marcus is. Also from Frankfurt, Germany, from Burbank, is that Tim Burton? I don't know what's going on. Boston, the Philippines, Russia, Tucson, Brooklyn, Astoria, and you know, just obviously Portland. We're so grateful. It's been amazing to spend this time. Film Vault Summer Camp continues through the month of August. You can catch up on everything that's happening with the museum at magazine online. Todd, thanks again. Stay safe. Everybody out there, stay safe. Wear a mask. If you have this mask, wear it.
I won't.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Everybody, thank you.
Stay safe.